imagine a time, right, when everything revolved around rituals, sacrifices to the gods, that sort of thing. That was the absolute center of society. And then, almost all at once, across the globe, this completely new way of thinking pops up, turns the focus inward.
Yeah, it's really something. This happened in different places, Eurasia mostly around the same time. And it just fundamentally changed how humans saw themselves, the world, everything.
It's wild because we're talking about societies that, didn't have much contact, if any, yet they all seem to hit on these profound philosophical, spiritual insights almost simultaneously.
Like a collective turning point in, well, human thought.
Exactly. And that's precisely what we're getting into today. This whole idea of the Axial Age, we're going to explore that and specifically look at how the Upanishads in India fit in as a really key part of this global shift.
Right. We got some fascinating source material that really unpacks it, the social background, the big ideas that came out of it.
So for you listening, if you've ever wondered where many of these, deep philosophical or spiritual ideas we still talk about actually came from,
Then this deep dive is definitely for you.
yeah, think of it as a shortcut, maybe. A way to quickly grasp a really foundational moment in human intellectual history.
Our mission, then, is pretty clear. Pull out the most important insights on the Axial Age and the Upanishads from the sources we have.
We want to give you the context, explain the key shifts, and talk about the lasting impact. Sound good?
Oh, great.
Okay, so the Axial Age. This concept really comes from Karl Jaspers, the philosopher.
That's the one. Jaspers pointed to this period, let's say roughly 800 down to 200 BCE, where he saw this simultaneous and independent flourishing of what he called universalizing thought.
Independent being the key word there.
Crucial. He saw it across Eurasia. You had Confucius, Lao Tse in China,
Right.
the Buddha, Mahavira, the Upanishadic sages in India, Zoroaster in Persia, the Hebrew prophets, the early Greek philosophers.
Wow, that's quite a lineup.
Yeah.
All active in that same broad window.
Pretty much. It's still kind of mind-boggling, that level of intellectual energy bubbling up in so many different places at roughly the same time.
So what actually defined it? What were the key features of this Axial Age thinking?
Well, Jaspers identified several things. First, and maybe foremost, is that move towards universalizing thought. Meaning thinkers started talking about truths or religious principles or moral codes that weren't just for their people or their city. They were aiming for ideas applicable to everyone.
Okay, so moving beyond the purely local or tribal, grappling with the big human questions.
Exactly. And tied right into that is what's often called the ethical turn.
Ethical turn.
Yeah, a much stronger emphasis on ethical behavior, on morality, and this idea that the ultimate reality, whatever that might be, is itself moral or has a moral dimension. It wasn't just about doing the right rituals anymore.
So it's not just what you do, but how you live, the kind of person you are. That starts to matter profoundly.
Precisely. It becomes central. Another major feature was a critique of existing norms.
People pushing back against tradition.
Definitely. Questioning, sometimes outright rejecting, ideas and customs that had maybe gone unquestioned for generations. Authority wasn't just accepted blindly anymore.
That must have felt pretty radical, I imagine. A lot of disruption.
Oh, for sure. And alongside that, you see a growing emphasis on the individual spiritual quest.
So less about just the group and more about personal journeys.
Yes. People looking for their own salvation or enlightenment or understanding, personal values, personal connection to the ultimate, that becomes much more important.
A shift towards individual responsibility in a way, spiritually speaking.
Absolutely. And intellectually, you get this really interesting tension emerging, this interplay between rationality and myth.
Logos versus mythos.
That's the classic framing, yeah.
Yeah.
Reason and logic, logos, starting to grapple with traditional myths as ways of explaining the world. They weren't always opposed, but the relationship was definitely changing, becoming more complex.
Interesting.
And one more thing, the rise of traveling scholars, thinkers, teachers, moving around, sharing these new ideas.
The ancient world's information network.
Yeah.
Spreading the word.
You got it. That exchange was vital.
Okay, so our sources mention specific examples across these cultures. Can we touch on those briefly? Just to be more concrete.
Sure. So in Persia, you have Zoroastrianism really taking shape with its ideas about moral dualism, good versus evil, and importantly, human free will.
Okay.
In India, besides the Upanishads, which we'll get to, you have the emergence of early Buddhism, the Four Noble Truths, the Eightfold Path, and Jainism with Mahavira, all focused on escaping suffering.
And Greece. That's the one many people might know best.
Right, the birthplace of Western philosophy, as we often think of it. Socrates, Plato, Aristotle using reason, logic, ethics, metaphysics to understand reality. A huge emphasis on rational inquiry.
And China. Different again, I assume.
Very much so. You had Confucianism focused on social harmony, ethics, proper conduct, moral cultivation, and Taoism looking toward the natural order, the Tao, spontaneity, living in harmony with nature.
And don't forget the Levant.
Absolutely. Prophetic Judaism was developing its strong monotheistic tradition, but also a powerful emphasis on social justice, on ethics commanded by God.
It really does paint a picture of, well, a world simultaneously grappling with the biggest questions, but in their own unique ways. So what caused this? It couldn't have just happened in a vacuum.
No, definitely not. The sources trace a kind of evolution in how societies were organized. You start way back with small kinship bands. Cooperation there is pretty straightforward. It's based on shared genes, kin selection or basic reciprocity. I scratch your back.
You scratch mine. Got it. Simple enough for small groups.
Right. But as groups get bigger, that doesn't scale very well. So you see the development of tribal alliances. Now you need other ways to bond people together.
Like shared stories, rituals.
Exactly. Cultural mechanisms, common symbols, myths, rituals, creating what one source calls virtual kinship. A shared identity beyond immediate family.
Okay, makes sense.
Then you often see the rise of chiefdoms. Centralized power, maybe based on claimed ancestry, keeping control through dependence, sometimes fear. But these chiefdoms, they often had stability problems. They weren't always long-lasting.
Right, okay. And this is where the Axial Age comes in as a different solution.
That's a fascinating way the source puts it. It suggests the Axial Age offered a new kind of story of life, a new foundation for solidarity and cooperation that could work on a much larger scale, moving past the limits of those earlier chiefdoms.
A new narrative for humanity, almost.
You could say that. These thinkers were providing frameworks that could unite much larger, more diverse groups of people. And the period before the Axial Age, say around the 6th century BCE, seems to have been particularly turbulent.
What was going on then?
A lot. Our sources point to major population growth and urbanization. Cities were expanding rapidly, throwing diverse people together, straining old systems, causing friction.
Growing pains on a massive scale.
Definitely. You also had a lot of political experimentation and social conflict. New state systems were emerging, often through violence. It was an unstable time politically in many regions.
Sounds stressful.
It likely was. Plus, you saw the hardening of class hierarchies. Power and wealth got concentrated, creating big social divisions. And that creates tension, people questioning the fairness of it all.
Ethical questions arising from social structure.
Right. And when different cultures and belief systems started mixing more, especially in those growing cities, you got cultural pluralism, which could be exciting, but also led to a kind of crisis of belief. People started asking, are our old traditions really the only way, the right way?
Inherited truths weren't enough anymore.
Exactly. The source talks about a feeling of historical liminality, like being caught between worlds, the old ways crumbling, the new not yet fully formed. A time of uncertainty.
A gap where new ideas could emerge.
Precisely. And crucially, you started getting an educated class, people with the leisure time to actually sit and think about meaning, ethics, the nature of reality.
Thinking becomes a specialty almost.
You could say that. And finally, don't underestimate the spread of writing.
Ah, technology.
Absolutely. Writing allows complex ideas to be recorded, shared widely, analyzed, critiqued in a way that purely oral traditions just can't match. It's a game changer for intellectual development.
So it's like a perfect storm of factors: stress, mixing of cultures, instability, but also new tools like writing and leisure time for reflection.
That's a good way to put it. A confluence of things creating the conditions for this profound shift.
Okay, so let's talk about the changes themselves. What were the really big transformations the Axial Age brought?
Well, one of the absolute biggest was this new vision of cosmic order.
Meaning?
Thinkers across these different regions started talking about an objective, transcendent moral or cosmic order, something bigger than the whims of local gods or spirits. Often, this involved drawing a clearer line between the divine or the ultimate and the mundane world.
A sense of a higher reality, maybe?
Yes, exactly. And this went hand in hand with increased human self-awareness. People started asking deeper questions about reality, about suffering, and crucially, started striving for some kind of liberation from suffering or union with that higher reality.
So not just accepting fate, but actively seeking a way out or a way up.
Right, and this naturally led to the birth of reasoning and philosophy as major forces.
We touched on that with logos versus mythos.
Yes. While myths didn't disappear, there was this growing engagement with rationality, with observation as ways to understand the world. Now, it's interesting, the sources note a difference. In places like India, Persia, Judea, the new insights were often presented as divine revelation.
Reveal truth.
Whereas in Greece and China, it was often framed more as the result of human reason, observation, and critical thought.
But either way, thinking itself was becoming central.
Hugely central. The emphasis on thinking for oneself, whether it's Confucius encouraging analysis, Buddha urging personal investigation, or Socrates constantly questioning that, was revolutionary. It's the bedrock for so much of modern philosophy and science.
And religion itself changed, didn't it? Became more about morality.
Definitely. That's the moral imperatives and salvation piece. Religion and ethics got deeply woven together.
How so?
Old myths often got reinterpreted with new ethical meanings. And achieving salvation or liberation or enlightenment, whatever the goal was, became linked to living according to this transcendent moral order. Your moral character in this life suddenly had ultimate significance.
Wow. So your actions really echoed into eternity, so to speak.
In many of these systems, yes, and this ties directly into the emphasis on individual morality.
Okay, break that down.
Moral rules, rewards, punishments, they became much more personal. It wasn't just about the tribe or the community standing. It was about your soul, your karma, your relationship with the divine or the moral law.
Individual accountability.
Exactly. The concept of individual moral responsibility really takes root. And the idea that religious truths aren't just inherited. You have to sort of personally assent to them, understand them for yourself.
This also led to that idea of anthropological dualism.
Right. The source uses that term. It's the idea of the self, the soul, the mind, whatever you call it, as an independent unit, something distinct from the body or the purely social identity, something that needs to be cultivated, improved, saved.
The individual self takes center stage.
It really does. And salvation or enlightenment becomes a possibility for each individual, not just for priests or kings.
That sounds incredibly empowering, but also maybe a bit daunting. A lot of responsibility.
Both, probably. And interestingly, this focus on the individual also led, perhaps paradoxically, to a greater emphasis on universal solidarity and cooperation, at least in principle.
How does that work? More individual focus leads to more universalism.
Well, the idea started to spread that all humans share this capacity for reason, for moral understanding, for achieving enlightenment. The focus shifted from tribal or ethnic markers to shared human characteristics.
Okay. If everyone has this inner potential,
then the wisdom, the path, it's meant for the whole species, right? It transcends borders, classes, ethnicities. The goal becomes transforming individuals to achieve a kind of universal solidarity.
and you start seeing institutions emerge with that universal mission in mind.
Exactly. Religions or philosophical schools aiming to reach everyone, accountable to a higher universal authority rather than just local powers.
A truly global vision, even back then. Okay, let's zoom in now on India's specific contribution during this time. The Upanishads. How do they fit this axial age pattern?
The Upanishads, popping up roughly in that same 800-200 BCE window, are really India's profound answer to these axial age questions. They represent a major shift within the Indian tradition itself.
A shift from what to what?
From the earlier Vedic focus on external rituals, sacrifices, appeasing gods for worldly benefits, towards a deep inward inquiry. The focus moves from the outer sacrificial fire to the inner light of self-knowledge.
Okay, that sounds very axial. And the sources mention key early texts.
Yes, texts like the Paudaranyaka and Chandogya Upanishads are among the earliest and most foundational. They lay out some core concepts.
Such as, what are the big ideas in the Upanishads?
Well, two central concepts are Atman and Brahman. Atman is the individual self, the soul, the deep consciousness within each person.
Okay.
And Brahman is the ultimate reality, the ground of all being, the universal consciousness, the source of everything.
The big picture.
The biggest picture. And the absolutely stunning central revelation of the Upanishads is that Atman is Brahman. Your innermost self is identical to the ultimate reality of the universe.
Oh, okay. That's a big idea.
It's huge. And it changes everything. The goal isn't appeasing external gods anymore. The goal becomes moksha, liberation.
Liberation from what?
From the cycle of birth and death, from suffering, from ignorance. And you achieve it through realizing that identity, Through direct experiential knowledge that your Atman is Brahman, it's about self-realization, not external rewards.
So knowledge, specifically self-knowledge, becomes the key.
The ultimate key. This emphasis on inner realization, on wisdom, on introspection, over just outward action, really reshaped Indian values profoundly.
And that concept of the inner Agnihotram, what's that about?
Ah, yes. The Agnihotram was the traditional Vedic fire sacrifice. The inner Agnihotram is a metaphor used in the Upanishads. It means the true sacrifice isn't pouring ghee on an external fire, it's the ritual of introspection, tending the inner fire of awareness and knowledge.
Beautiful. So it perfectly captures that inward turn.
Exactly. It's the essence of the Axial Age shift in the Indian context. The path to the divine, to ultimate reality, is found within.
So the Upanishads aren't just scriptures. They represent, as the source says, a kind of civilizational rebirth for India, a fundamental reorientation of thought.
Absolutely. A profound deepening, an internalization that really exemplifies that global axial age current.
Okay. Now, we should probably acknowledge this whole axial age concept. It's neat, but it's not completely uncontroversial among historians and scholars, is it?
No, that's true. It's a powerful idea, but it's definitely debated. Our sources mention this as well.
What are some of the main criticisms or debates?
Well, some scholars question whether there's really a single unifying common denominator across all these diverse regions and thinkers that Jaspers grouped together. Was the problem they were all responding to really the same?
Or were they just different changes happening concurrently?
Sort of. Others argue the changes weren't quite as sudden or revolutionary as Jaspers perhaps implied, suggesting more continuity with earlier traditions. And there's always debate about who counts which figures or movements should be in the Axial Age framework and which should be out. The boundaries are fuzzy.
Right. It's not like there was a membership card.
Yeah, exactly. So the more nuanced view, which seems more widely accepted today, might be less about a strict unified age and more about axiality.
Axiality.
Yeah, the idea that these kinds of traits, the inward turn, universalizing ethics, critique of tradition, emphasis on transcendence, tend to emerge in societies as they reach a certain level of complexity, often independently. It's more about recurring patterns than a single historical event.
So recognizing the shared characteristics without insisting on a perfectly synchronized global moment.
Precisely. It acknowledges the similarities Jaspers saw, which are undeniable, but allows for more historical nuance and variation.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's try and wrap this up. Can we summarize the main takeaways from this deep dive?
Sure. We've looked at the Axial Age, this incredible period, roughly 800 to 200 BCE, as a time of huge intellectual and spiritual change across Eurasia.
A global transformation of thought.
Right. We saw how things like urbanization, social conflict, new ways of thinking about kinship, and the spread of writing helped create the conditions for it.
The perfect storm we talked about.
Exactly. And the key features that emerged were things like universalizing thought, a strong ethical focus, questioning old norms, and a new emphasis on the individual's spiritual journey and self-cultivation.
And India's major contribution, the Upanishads.
Yes, with their profound inward turn, the concepts of Atman and Brahman, and the goal of liberation, moksha, through self-realization, a perfect example of this axial dynamic.
Okay. And connecting this back to you, the listener, why does understanding the axial age matter today?
Well, because so many of the philosophical systems, the ethical frameworks, the religious traditions that are still incredibly influential all over the world have their roots right here in this period.
It's foundational.
It really is. Understanding the shift towards individual introspection, towards seeking universal truths, it gives you crucial context for, well, for a lot of how we still think about ourselves and the big questions today. These ideas are still very much alive.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. As you consider that profound shift from external ritual to inner inquiry that really define the axial age, what parts of our own modern world, our assumptions, our ways of living, might be ready for a similar kind of fundamental reevaluation?
Or maybe, are we living through our own kind of axial moment right now, facing our own crises of meaning in a rapidly changing world? Something to ponder.